Okay, so I just wanted to start with an image of the, and I hope everybody can see this. These are the editions starting with Kate's and going up to Stewart and Clark and David Bradshaw's edition. And I also included Edward L. Bishop or Ted Bishop's image of the holograph draft because it's clearly part of this construction of the reception of Jacob's Room. And now I'm going to stop share and introduce our two speakers and briefly myself. And then Rita, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Okay, because you're now part of the presentations. And are we okay with that? All right. So our first speaker will be, hang on here, wrong place. Again, this is really, everybody has to forgive me for being apparently not very well organized. Where are you? Okay, this is, I'm sorry, pause again. Kate, I thought I, good. Our first speaker is Kate Flint. She is a provost professor of art history and English at the University of Southern California and works on British and American cultural, visual, and literary history in the long 19th century. She is an author of numerous books and articles, including most recently Flash, Photography, Writing, and Surprising Illumination. Her current project, The Long Today, 19th Century Painting and Environmental Change, explores the depiction of the often overlooked natural world in paintings from this period and uses the work of contemporary artists to show how the slow violence of environmental damage was already latent in 19th century representations. Earlier in her career, Kate edited several works by Woolf, including The Waves for Penguin and Flush and Jacob's Room for the OUP World's Classics. And our second speaker is Suzanne Raitt. She is Vice Dean for Arts, Humanities, and Interdisciplinary Studies and Chancellor Professor of English at William and Mary. Her books include May Sinclair, A Modern Victorian, published by Oxford in 2000, and Vita and Virginia, The Work and Friendship of V. Sackville West and Virginia Woolf, Oxford, 1993. She co-edited a collection of essays with Trudy Tate called Women's Fiction and the Great War, published by Oxford in 1997. And her editions include the Cambridge edition of Virginia Woolf's Orlando, co-edited with Ian Blythe, and in 2018, the Norton Critical Edition of Virginia Woolf, Jacob's Room in 2007, as well as Virginia Woolf's Night and Day for Oxford World's Classics in 1992. And she is currently writing a book about twin culture, exploring the different stories that are told about them. For example, the evil twin, the lost twin, and trying to find out why twins are so fascinating to so many people. And I myself, introducing myself as Vara Neverow. I've been at Southern Connecticut State for more than 33 years. I am the current editor of the Virginia Woolf Miscellany, and I organized the second conference on Virginia Woolf. And I will stop there and ask Rita to introduce herself.
Thank you, Vara. I'm Rita Drummond-Viana. I teach at a university here in Brazil. I teach mostly British and Irish lit, and I have no books to my name, which I feel very inadequate about, but after Beth's lecture, after Beth's plenary, I feel less inadequate about. So that's it.
Okay, and I should have mentioned in passing that I edited the 2008 copy of Jacob's Room that was hosted by Mark Hussey, who invited me to do it. And so I think we should begin. Kate, this is exciting.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really, truly honored to be here today and to be a part of this panel. And I'm going to share my screen with you all and hope that that comes across clearly. So it's been 3.5 decades since I held the manuscript of Jacob's Room in my hands, sitting not a little awestruck in the Bird collection in New York Public Library. An editor at OUP had taken a chance on me as somebody who could edit the novel for the World's Classics series. And looking back, I realized what an incredible, sorry, this is jammed now. There we go. What an incredible combination of luck and privilege that represented. I was indeed a young academic at Oxford who loved reading Woolf and who taught her, as we taught most things from Shakespeare onwards, but had not published much on her. And I had absolutely zero training, practical or theoretical, in editorial work. I did some rapid self-education on what it means to edit a text, relying especially on Jerome McGann's, Don Mackenzie's, and J. Thomas Tansell's insights. But the scanty pages of notes in the edition reflect all too well the cultural assumptions underpinning OUP's editorial policy at that time. And I don't know if Suzanne will want to speak to that as well, that one should only annotate references that might be obscure. I didn't stop to ask obscure to whom. Those were incredibly underprofessionalized days, and as well, my own naivety just jumps back off the page at me. But even if I see now how blinkered I was in some ways when I came to edit the novel, which in the late 1980s hadn't really garnered a whole lot of critical attention, it was an incredibly exciting experience. The experience of seeing the manuscript in particular was instant and visceral. Of course, this was the knowledge that here was Woolf's own production in unmediated form. This was a truly Benjaminian encounter with aura. To some extent, you can, of course, see what the holograph looked like in Ted Bishop's transcription, which shows exactly what was excised, substituted, interwoven. And Suzanne's Norton edition usefully includes a number of transcribed pages as well. But turning handwriting into print can't capture that material immediacy of observing, for example, where Woolf's pen started to run out of ink, where she must have paused and reloaded it and begun writing again. And for me, there was something incredibly intimate in seeing that she ruled her own margins in a thick and usually fairly blunt blue pencil. I'm afraid I'm having to use an example from To the Lighthouse, but it brings home both the weird purpleness of that ink and that kind of none too regular ruled margin. The first, in this, I think also there's a kind of thread of connection to that blurring of ink and emotion with it, which the novel begins. And this first-hand encounter with the 3 notebooks that contain most of the manuscript, as well as with the 8 disparate pages of corrected typescript in the Monk's House collection, brought me into corporeal as well as intellectual proximity to the act of writing and revision. And through the vehemence or tidiness of crossings out and insertions, through the gaps and spaces on the page, it brought home the physical labor of composition, a manifestation of the interplay of body and mind. But to be sure, I didn't write about that at the time. In the relatively brief, indeed very brief number of pages allocated me by OUP for the introduction, I think I did a workmanlike enough job, or I've been relieved to think so, not having looked at it for 30 years until now. Plenty of things that one would expect are there, emphasis on the elegiac and transient and on the undertones of war, balanced against the importance of living in and recording the present. Woolf's interest at that point in her career as a novelist on depicting the everyday on stressing subjectivity and the mind's freedom to range over the material in front of it, the impossibility of ever knowing someone, not least Jacob, who is both individualistic enigma and a generational archetype. And of course, not least because it was the late 80s, I drew attention to her Woolf's attack on the complacent nature of pre-war patriarchal formations and to the novel's sustained, quiet feminism. And trained as an art historian, as I was, as well as a literary critic, it's hardly surprising that I was drawn to the novel's interest in structure and architectural space, to its ever-changing qualities of colours and lights, to shifts of scale, and to what Winifred Holtby, as early as 1932, understood as a kind of cinematographic technique. More interesting by far, though, than my introduction, I now think, is the excised material that I included in an appendix to this edition, and that I wrote about in an article that Suzanne was good enough to include in the Norton. A significant proportion of these excised passages are about women's private, physical, even sexual lives, passages that, as the numerous crossings out indicate, Woolf herself might have found really hard to write and then maybe too awkward, too personal to include, especially in a novel that is so much concerned with women's social rather than private lives, with the awkward ways in which women inhabit both literal and figurative rooms designed for men. Seeing these passages in the manuscript, though, discovering, as it were, a hidden, even suppressed text, feeling that I was in a particularly intimate relationship with the novel, that was thrilling. And it's this experience of encounter that has stuck with me over the years. Unlike most of you, I'm not a regular Woolf scholar. My research and teaching is primarily in visual and cultural history. But a couple of years back, some grad students asked me if I would teach a course on the visual world of Virginia Woolf. And this was a terrific opportunity to go back to her writing and, of course, to revisit Jacob's Room, which had changed and morphed utterly in the last 30 years. Of course, the particular slant of the course, the visual world, determined the readings for that week by Jane Goldman and, most appropriately, by Vara. We read the novel, as others have done, alongside Vanessa Bell's paintings from the immediate pre-war period. We thought about the work performed by painting and by sculpture within the novel itself. We picked up on shifting perspectives, seeing them not just as a product of different subjectivities and different emotions, but of different modes of looking. We considered angles of vision and the implications of noting eyes themselves, like Bramham's, when sculpting Fanny Elmer, rather prominent and rather bloodshot, as if from staring and staring. And as I often do in grad classes, I ask participants to contribute to a class blog on a weekly basis. For this course, choosing a passage, even a sentence, on which to center some remarks about the visual that then get woven into the structure of that particular week's seminar. What did they see? And did they see differently from my encounter with the novel 30 plus years ago? In fact, there was some considerable overlap. There was a huge emphasis on colours, the yellow stamps and green stamps on letters, orange trees as brief balls of yellow among green leaves. And this time round, I was certainly more struck myself by the astonishing agitation and vitality of colour that animates the novel. And I kept asking why so much yellow in it. There was considerable speculation about filmic influence, noting the novel's constant, consistent stress on ephemerality and visual elusiveness, its procession of shadows. And we looked at effects of lighting, sunshine reflecting off greenhouses, the unshaded electric light of Bramham's studio, the fog, the lamplight, the shades of London. And we considered the visual means through which absence, emptiness, and trauma are brought home. And that emphasis on trauma, on the availability of theoretical formulations through which to articulate it, is one pointer to broad shifts in critical attention since I edited the novel. Another is the rise of eco-criticism, and here I was super pleased when one student, Sarah Frontiera, took up the highly specific description from early in the novel, which you see here. The upper wings of the moth which Jacob held were undoubtedly marked with kidney-shaped spots of a fulvous hue, but there was no crescent upon the underwing. And she used this to expand on the recurrent emphasis in the novel from the recurrent emphasis on patterning, from irregularly piebald cows to the checkered interplay of light and shade. And this is where the eco-critical really made its appearance, to the ways that Woolf's descriptions completely dissolve distinctions between human and non-human pattern making. And I want just finally to think about that emphasis on blurring boundaries, on blurring, on indistinctness, and the fact that Woolf criticism has long encouraged the splicing of the personal with the academic. And I'm thinking back above all to Rachel Blau du Plessis' The Pink Guitar. When this appeared in 1990, I was right in the middle of preparing my edition of Jacob's Room. I adored du Plessis' book. I could never in a million years imagine having the courage to incorporate my own experience into published academic work. But here I am finding that the touchstone for me when talking about it was indeed that personal moment of encounter, a highly personal one. I cherish the moment of that sensory impact. And even if one's not had that rare and tactile and emotional privilege of holding the manuscript oneself, Jacob's Room depends, rereading after rereading, on its appeal to the senses and on the power of affect. And I think that it's because of its sensory charge that its prose seems so immediate and its impact so direct. It's really quite a shock to realize that it's 100 years old. Thank you.
Fantastic. That was so lovely. And we now go on to Suzanne. And that would be right now.
So I'm going to unmute myself. I'm happy to share the text of this, of what I'm about to say in the chat. I think I'll just do that without asking you whether you want me to, because after all, you don't have to look at it. So,
that sounds good, Suzanne. Thank you.
Very efficient.
Well, who knows? Okay. This should work. If it doesn't, tell me. And now I'm going to share my screen for a PowerPoint. Okay. So I decided not to talk about my edition. I mean, it never occurred to me to talk about it really, only because it was a Norton Critical edition. I was thinking all the time about students when I did it. And to me, it's been superseded many times, but especially by Stuart Clark and David Bradshaw's edition that just came out. So because I was intimidated at the idea of talking about Jacob's Room at all in this company, and especially in the shadow of Stuart and David, I chose a somewhat different tack. But actually listening to Kate, I can see that really it wasn't that different from the approach that Kate took after all, where Kate started out by talking about her encounter with Jacob's Room. Actually, my remarks today are also about an encounter both with and within Jacob's Room, and that encounter is between a middle-aged woman, which Kate was not when she held the manuscript at Berg, but which I am now. And so I'm hoping that our papers will dovetail really well together, even though my approach is slightly different. So I came up with a title for my paper before I had any idea what I would say, trying to think about what it might have meant for Jacob to become an old man, to become as old as the book that that created him and in which he lives. So Unlike the book that created and sustains him, Jacob Flanders did not live to be 100. As everybody, and of course, one of the great things about speaking at this conference is that everybody knows everything already about Woolf. So on the other hand, that means that when I say something, I know you already know it, and I'm going to show you pictures and you all already have seen them. So anyway, it's a trip down memory lane for us all. Woolf's experience in her immediate family was that people often died in their 40s or even sooner. And this is where I can't make my, hold on. Yeah. I'm going to see if I can make this work using, yeah, there we go. Her mother died. So Woolf's experience in her immediate family was that people often died in their 40s or even sooner. And you all know this. Her mother died at 49, her sister at 28, and her brother Toby at 26. And of course, you also all know that she thought of Toby as she wrote Jacob's Room, especially as she finished Jacob's Room and wondered about putting in an epigraph that invoked him. During the years before Woolf started to write Jacob's Room in 1920, in addition to her carrying in her memory and in her body and in her emotions the deaths of those family members, Britain in general was convulsed, and not just Britain, by wave after wave of early deaths during the Great War and the influenza epidemic. When Woolf says that Jacob and his fellow students at Cambridge in the first decade of the 20th century are simple young men who would, but there is no need to think of them, grown old. Many of them, of course, will not do that, and Jacob is among them. So this very short paper looks at age in Jacob's Room, and specifically at the encounter between middle age and youth. Sorry about the shoes. I thought I wanted actually us to have a visual sense of what shoes look like when they've been worn many times. Holding out Jacob's old shoes after his death, his mother Betty asks a question, which is the point of the book. What am I to do with these, Mr. Bonamy? She held out a pair of Jacob's old shoes. The shoes represent the imprint Jacob left on the world, as well as on his shoe leather, the memories, the yearning, the absence. Old shoes hold the unique wrinkles left by their wearers' feet. In some way, having read the novel, we are all those shoes, altered by our reading, remembering not the real Jacob, but his imprint on the page. As Woolf says in Jacob's Room, either we are young or growing old. Jacob stays young while we, his relics, like his shoes, grow old. Woolf in particular felt herself growing old while she was writing Jacob's Room. She started to imagine the novel the day after she turned 38, and she noticed. In January 1920, she wrote in her diary, "The day after my birthday. In fact, I'm 38. Well, I've no doubt I'm a great deal happier than I was at 28, and happier today than I was yesterday, having this afternoon arrived at some idea of a new form for a new novel." Woolf's achievement in Jacob's Room was meaningful to her, partly because she felt herself entering middle age at the same time. She turned 40 about 10 months before it was published, writing in her diary after Leonard read and praised the manuscript, "There's no doubt in my mind that I have found out how to begin at 40 to say something in my own voice." Being 40 was as much of a milestone as publishing her first truly experimental novel, and the two were intertwined in her mind. In Jacob's Room, Mrs. Norman at 50 is elderly. Woolf at 40 was also contemplating her own death. The writing of Jacob's Room was interrupted several times by lengthy bouts of illness, some of them apparently serious. Woolf wrote nothing for 2 months in the summer of 1921. All the horrors of the dark cupboard of illness once more displayed. And in mid-August of the same year, considered making her will. In early 1922, A heart specialist diagnosed a heart murmur and warned of premature death. In fact, as you all know, there was in fact nothing wrong with her heart, but she entered that year feeling that she might not have long to live. Turning 40 was to be confronted with her own mortality. It was a turning point as well as a turning of age. My theory is that at 40, one either increases the pace or slows down. The Jacob we know is blissfully unaware that he will not live for long, at least at the times when we see him, because of course his experiences in war are never depicted. But Woolf, as she worked on the novel, was acutely aware that she would not live forever. Survivors are merely the dead in waiting. Hermione Lee, in her magisterial biography, notes that Jacob's Room is Woolf's last novel centered entirely on a single youthful character or placed entirely in a pre-war world. From now on, she would deal more with middle age and growing old. My reading of Jacob's Room contradicts this observation. I think Woolf's exploration of middle age has started already in Jacob's Room. In the final brief section of this paper, I will explore the depiction of middle and old age in Jacob's Room, the time of life that Jacob himself will never experience. So are there any old people in Jacob's Room? There is indeed a floating cast of characters who are described as old and whom we meet briefly. For example, George Garfit, leaning over his garden gate, smoking his pipe, is described as old. He fought in the Crimea, so at that point in the novel, which Stuart Clark dates at around 1890, George Garfit might be in his 60s. Mr. Floyd's parents are old. He, we know, is in his mid to late 30s, so they're in their late 50s, perhaps. It was actually kind of depressing to see what age was called old in the novel, but anyway. The text spends little time on these old people. They have walk-on parts at best. This is not a novel for old people or about old people. They have no place here. The perspective of women who are called elderly, however, frames the text. Mrs. Norman, in the railway carriage with Jacob, we're told is 50 years old, and she is described as elderly a number of times. Betty, Jacob's mum, is in her mid-40s when the novel opens, and in her late 60s when it ends. The novel opens with her tears and closes with her grief, as if this is her story as well as her son's. The story itself is told by a woman, the narrator, who is 10 years older than her youthful subject and whose feelings towards Jacob, like Betty's, are maternal. She feels excluded. She feels protected. She feels protective. Granted 10 years seniority and a difference of sex, fear of him comes first. This is swallowed up by a desire to help. I've come to read the novel as the story of an extended encounter between elderly women and doomed youth. As Kate explains in the essay that she herself just talked about, the text is organized around a generalized perception of difference between the sexes. And I would add, around a perception of the difference between youth and middle age. Anxious, elderly mothers struggle to find their place in a world of young men. Woolf mourns the young even as she embraces her own middle age and confronts her own mortality. Jacob at 100? No. But Woolf at 40? Emphatically yes. Thanks.
So fabulous and really engaging and provocative. We are going to switch from those who are actually present to one of our presenters who will be doing it exclusively from afar. This is Ted Bishop, who was initially going to join us and then realized that he couldn't have Jacob's Room and James Joyce coinciding. And so instead of his being actually present, we have a video of him talking about Jacob's Room, and I will do a brief bio for him and also mention that what I had said earlier, which is that he did transcribe the holograph, and so his contributions are dual in the sense that he's created a platform for our understanding of the text that we would have no access to unless it had been published by Mark Hussey at Pace University. Edward L. Bishop, who now goes by Ted, is a Canadian author and academic, a now retired professor of English literature and film studies at the University of Alberta. His first non-academic publication was Riding with Rilke, Reflections on Motorcycles and Books. And that actually was associated with his own physical harm that caused him to be in hospital for a very long time, having to do with motorcycles. But it's a travel memoir, and it was a Canadian bestseller. And he also was the winner of the Motorcycle Award of Excellence for Best Motorcycle Book. And I think that there's something sort of a little bit of Jacob's Room and Jacob himself in Ted's interesting work. And he, of course, has something to share with us, but it's going to be something that Amy is going to activate for us because she has it and I didn't dare. Okay, let him speak.
Do you all see my screen all right?
We do.
All right, let's see if the audio works.
Let's hope.
My name is Ted Bishop. I used to publish under Edward Bishop. I'm retired from the University of Alberta and now work from a gazebo of my.
Whoops. We just lost it. It was working.
Okay, I wonder if it's working. Let me try something.
Okay.
Good morning or afternoon.
Okay.
My name is Ted Bishop. I used to publish under Edward Bishop. I'm retired from the University of Alberta and now work from a gazebo of my own. We're on Treaty 6 land, which I'm pleased to acknowledge as a gathering place of the Métis and many Indigenous nations. I want to thank Vara for inviting me and Amy for pressing me to contribute something short to the conference. By the time you see this, I'll be out of the country, off the continent, and a good thing too. Vara said, give us your insights. And I thought, I don't have any insights. And as I reread the book, I thought, I only have unsights. The opposite. I can't believe I ever thought I understood Jacob's Room. It's a really strange book. Part of the problem is that in editing, it takes you down to a granular level and it undermines any sense of the whole. But in any case, I have only musings, which I'll share with you. One of the first things that hit me reading my 100-year-old second impression is the printing conventions. There was this guy who wrote an essay called Mind the Gap about Jacob's Room, but he didn't notice the gaps surrounding the semicolons, which break up the prose. And if you look at the bottom of the page here, there's a sentence, the whole city was pink and gold, domed, mist-wreathed, resonant, strident. There's one space in front of the semicolon, two spaces after, and this has the effect of breaking up the prose even more than it would be normally. So it contributes to that sense of reading shards, a whole made up of fragments, like the poetry of Pound or Eliot. And these were standard printing conventions, but they're a reminder in this temporal leveling age of the internet that this is a book as well as a text that is not of our era. And the fragmentation, this is obvious, but it never really struck me before, extends to the dialogue. People never answer each other, or at least the narrator doesn't record the whole conversation. With over 170 named characters, I suppose she has to get on with it. But we're always being tugged onward. At the same time, we're also not. I read Jacob's Room first as a young man, younger than Jacob, having spent part of the winter in Greece and traveling out to Afghanistan, discovering, quote, how tremendously pleasant it is to be alone on one's own, cut off from the whole thing. And I remembered the novel as being all about Italy and Greece. This time through, though I identify more with the older characters, it seemed to take forever to get to Greece. And in fact, it's about 3/4 of the way through. There's little narrative drive, not much plot, just chronology. There's movement in the syntactical level, as in that great line in chapter 8 about the, quote, unpublished works of women written by the fireside in pale profusion, dried by the flame, for the blotting papers worn to holes and the nib cleft and clotted. So we zoomed from Betty Flanders' musings about Mrs. Jarvis down to that clotted nib. But in terms of the action, the narrator seems to be dawdling, meandering. And I began to think that the asides are an attempt to avoid the inevitable, Jacob's early death. Each flash forward to middle age for a minor character, such as the Reverend Floyd or the painter Edward Cruttenden, who winds up savagely painting orchards in Kent, is poignant for the narrator because she knows that for her, there'll be no middle age for Jacob. So that's where the narrative arc is taking her. And there's this tension, chronology pulling her forward and her wanting to put it off as long as possible. But it's more than avoidance. I recently went to a play called Bloomsday, and in it, the American boy says of an Irish girl he's fallen in love with, to her, time is not a series of neat single notes called the present, one played after another. No, to her, time is a chord, many notes, past, present, future, all real, all alive, and all played at once. And I think Woolf had this sense of time and culture and is trying to capture it here. The notion of a chord works for us as readers as well. Probably most of you came to Jacob's Room as I did, not as your first Woolf novel, but after, say Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, The Waves. And so we find in Jacob's Room echoes of these books. But of course, they're not echoes, they're anticipatory motifs. The book is an unwitting overture to her writing career, giving us all these brief melodies that she'll develop later. More than her later books, it seems to me Jacob's Room is a heuristic, an exploration, rather than a crystallization of a vision. And these melodies hold discordant notes. There's a touch of the grotesque that creeps in from time to time that I noted before, but was more prominent for me this time. Like those character mongers in chapter 12 who, quote, stuff out their victims' characters till they are swollen and tender as the livers of geese exposed to the fire. Or that slightly creeping wind at the beginning, making a shape bulge out from the cloth on the dresser. And by chapter 10, it's engaged in a sadomasochistic relationship with the tree in the cornfield. You should check it out. Tell me what you think. Maybe I'm being too harsh. But speaking of the grotesque, what's happening right now in Ukraine is grotesque. Putin justifies the war against Ukraine by trying to prove that it has no culture, that the country doesn't exist in any sense of the word. To oppose tyrants, we need not only boots on the ground, but books on the table, not just on shelves. An active archive with people who know how to negotiate it, how to defend it. Someone, I can't remember, is it Kipling, writes of how in peacetime people resent soldiers, think of them as violent louts, but then when war comes, they say, you're great, we love you, defenders of the land. As we speak, my university is making plans to demolish the Humanities Center, which I think is a perfect symbol. It's a just reflection of the academic industrial complex. The humanities aren't valued, we're regarded as nonviolent louts. But you need to keep the humanities alive, for there will come a time when the general populace will value you, will say, you're great, we love you, defenders of our land and culture, and they will shower research funds upon you. Okay, not really. But your work is important. The narrator observes that the young men at Cambridge hold their books as if they held in their hands something that would see them through. We need books, we need you to see us through. So Vera, thank you for giving me the opportunity to go back to Jacob's room to recover the essential strangeness of the book. Maybe that's the mark of a work of art. You think you know it, you're maybe a bit bored by it, you're exhausted with it, and then you go back to it after a time and you're astonished. I also want to thank Eric Savoy, who first suggested I edit the manuscript. He was kicked out of the bird collection by Lola Schladitz, who said, I won't have graduate students using my material for cheap theses. And Gerald Wandio, my tireless graduate research assistant, who is a far more insightful transcriber than I. So much of scholarship depends on assistants, adjuncts, the sessional lecturers who keep publishing, whether they have to or not. Their devotion sustains the culture. But I have to go, and I haven't even finished reading Jacob's Room yet. I want to see how it turns out. Thank you, and have a great conference.
More applause for somebody who is here from afar in a video format. I am going to share my own, I hope, brief observations about Jacob's Room, and that means that I have to get up a share screen, and let's see if we can do this successfully. And where are you? Slideshow and play from start. So probably I will do this better if I also have something else. So let me stop share for a moment. I'm sorry, I'm having a very disorganized evening, and I hope that you will forgive me for my misbehavior. This is not ideal. Okay, something I should have put up. This is really quite terrifying.
Vara, it might be because you are recording. Sometimes you have to give your thing permission to record.
Actually, it's something else that's going on that has nothing to do with you. It has to do with something that I've done wrong in my ability to create chaos here. So there it is. Okay, and I need to put this in the chat, but I think I'm going to do it a little bit later. So going back to this, I'm sorry, this is just great annoyance in terms of too many things going on at the same time. So this is I'm just having one of those problems. All right. And let's see. Does anybody know how this is? I'm having a fight here, as you can tell. I can't get out of being.
You want to stop? Do you want to stop sharing? Is that what you'd like?
Yeah, please. No, I actually have to continue sharing. So I'm going
If you click view options, you can exit full screen. The view options right next to where it says you're sharing your screen. You can exit full screen and you'll be able to look at other things on your computer, but we wouldn't see them, I don't think.
Okay, so I'm looking at you are screen sharing, stop share, and I can't find this.
Oh, you don't see your
Recording.
view options. Okay.
View, look at view, Vara.
Now look at view up in the corner.
Top right. Way top right, way right.
Okay, there's no view in this, irritatingly. Okay, so I am going to have
By hitting escape.
Yeah.
Its view is often nestled in the corner by the chat box, upper right, in the corner by the chat box.
I'm just seeing an entire screen. This is very peculiar. I'm going to stop share again. I've never had this experience before, but I think I'm going to do something different. And again, my apologies for craziness here.
Do you want to send it to me and I can share it while you look at your other thing?
Yes, please. Let's put that in the. This is bizarre.
Oh, we really have all been there when we're teaching online.
In terms of bizarre, yeah.
We all
Here's what's beautiful is that we're all tired and we're all on a slow roll and happy to take it easy. And for the recording, we can just edit this out.
Yes, that would be
good.
nice.
You're
because-
good.
Yeah. And now all I need to do is find what I need. And what I need is the PowerPoint. And I'm going to put this in there. Okay, that's exciting. And now we're going to try to find what we're supposed to be reading. And we've got that. And then we can also put that in the chat. I just really don't feel like this is fair that I'm doing this to people, because normally I'm quite competent, but right now apparently Jacob's room is creating complete chaos. And once again, I'm not going to be able to put that in because I can't find it. So
I will share your PowerPoint, Vara.
that's good, because you're going to need to click. So let's pretend that we're having a normal panel where everything is going smoothly. And I am going to talk about the evolving reception of Jacob's room over the decades of a century. And the PowerPoint is connected to what I'm going to read. In my talk, I want to trace the way that Jacob's room shifts from one moment or perspective to another without continuity in the narrative, but not by analyzing the text. Instead, I want to create a collage of random patterns that have emerged from instances of criticism and reception, decade by decade, starting with the reviews in 1922 and ending with the sole essay on Jacob's room that was published in 2022. For obvious reasons, I'm not delving into any of the texts. I'm just giving an overview of sampling, if you will. In 1922, the reviews of the novel were mixed, but only a few were actually scathing. And these are from Majumdar and McLaughlin's collection on the critical heritage of Woolf. And they're quite engaging for the most part. And there's the sense of Woolf being co-equal with her reviewers because these are her contemporaries. However, while it was garnering a degree of respect and engagement at the point of publication, though some people hated it, despite its experimental approach, it was accepted. But the initial positive reception faded over the next 50 years. Published in 1932, which is the next slide, Winifred Holtby's chapter on Jacob's room, appropriately titled and interestingly resonating with Kate Flint's mention of cinematography. That's the title of her chapter on Jacob's room. And it traces, quote, the indifference of fate, which abandons opal-shelled crabs to the mercilessness of children and abandons children to the mercilessness of war. Its melancholy, its extraordinary desolation are indefinable. But amusingly, Holtby observes that Woolf, unlike D.H. Lawrence, James Joyce, or Middleton Murray, dares to put sex in its place by treating it as if it's an ordinary thing that can be discussed without any consequences. David Deitches started his 1942 volume on Woolf before she died, and he was very stressed by her death. He finds very little to discuss about Jacob's room, and in the preface to his second edition, in which there are no revisions other than the preface, drawing on his preface, it's important to take into account that 2 decades later, he has realized that he regularly thinks more and more of Jacob's room the more he read it. And so there's an absence in his perception of the text when he first wrote about it, and in some ways clearly regrets it. In 1952, James Hafley finished his own dissertation, which was published later in 1954 by the University of California Press as The Glass Roof, Virginia Woolf as Novelist. And although Hafley only devotes about 10 full pages to Jacob's Room itself, he offers a very sophisticated analysis of Jacob's character and also intriguingly suggests that there are two narrators in charge of Jacob's Room, which is a topic that has come up elsewhere. One who is all-knowing and the other who is clueless about Jacob, although he does view the technique as a flaw. Dorothy Brewster's 1962 Virginia Woolf gives only 4 pages to the novel. She focuses on the depiction of London features and Woolf's exchanges with Lytton Strachey, and she offers a very snarky remark that some of the flights in the novel are flops, and it's more of a review than an analysis. J.J. Wilson, one of the founders of the Miscellany, wrote a 1963 review of Brewster's book and of Jean Gouget's 1962 publication of Virginia Woolf et son œuvre. And Wilson devotes 3 pages of a 4-page review to Gouget and only a paragraph to Brewster. And she observes regarding Brewster that she is not the new wave. And she mentions not only Gouget, but Hafley. And I'm tagging this because I think that this is, in fact, the turning point where Jacob's Room went from being regarded as sort of a freak early work that did not deserve attention, and it becomes more and more of a recognized and important contribution to the criticism. So with regard to, and again, these are going decade by decade, Barry Morgenstern's article, The Self-Conscious Narrator in Jacob's Room, published in 1972, is in fact the turning point regarding an in-depth, highly researched analysis of the text in its, if you will, critical reception. And he notes that while the prior scholars were oblivious to Woolf's nuanced intentions in presenting her narrator, and instead perceived Woolf herself as the storyteller, he now is bringing this creative voice into focus. And he also emphasizes his interest in the narrator's feminist inclinations. And points out that the narrator creates for the reader not only a portrait of Jacob, but of herself as a true cynic who speaks with sarcastic whimsy. Moving on to 82, Howard Harper, in Between Language and Silence, the novels of Virginia Woolf, offers the most detailed chapter on Woolf in the previous decades. And he looks at the closing passages of each chapter. He too is very, very intrigued in Jacob's engagement with his sense of masculinity. And he also looks closely at the patriarchal dimensions of the text, as well as the difference of sex, which obviously is something that the female narrator brings up. With the next decade, it is Ted Bishop and his very, very valuable contribution, The Subject in Jacob's Room, where he argues that the minor characters in Jacob's Room have a more interior life than Jacob, which is certainly so. And he draws on the holograph, which he would later transcribe, in crafting the argument, arguing and asserting rather that Woolf, far from creating character, seems to be going out of her way to uncreate character. And having just seen Ted Bishop, you can tell that this is some of his witticism. One of Bishop's key points is that the narrator is both character and device, and that we are meant to watch both, as well as to identify her search for Jacob and to feel her desire, and yet to appreciate the moral and political dimensions of her project. And you can see the layering and the complexity that's emerging after that 50-year gap in taking it into account. And of course, he's responsible, interestingly, for Mind the Gap. In 2002, Kathleen Wall published significant form in Jacob's Room, Ekphrasis and the Elegy, and she brings in Clive Bell, whom obviously Mark Hussey has brought into focus for us as Wolf scholars only very recently. And this is intriguing that the emphasis is on Bell's contribution to Wolf's own aesthetics and techniques, but Wall points out, and again, following the feminist thread, that Wolf counters Bell's and Roger Fry's view that appreciating art is a private aesthetic experience because it's restricted exclusively to privileged men, and women are denied that access. With Adolf Haberer's 2012 volume, sorry, a contribution to a volume, which is, I think it's actually available in its entirety online, so you can probably read the article. He has written Virginia Woolf's non-hero, My Name is Jacob, Catch Me If You Can, where he emphasizes the epistemological, aesthetic, and cultural disruption caused by the Great War, and this is obviously a thread that goes through the entire series of responses to Woolf's work, and also notes that Jacob is elusive, silent, missed by his mother and those who love him, but at the end, his death is not even mentioned, and he simply becomes radically absent, leaving his room empty. And this seems to be a little bit deflated in terms of offering new insights. But the single publication in 2022, Christopher James Wells' Doubt, Havelock Ellis, and Bisexuality in Jacob's Room is quite promising because he's taking a new perspective in which he's focusing on polymorphous perversity and the unclassifiable nature of bisexuality and sexuality, sexology that influenced Woolf's aesthetic technique of narrating a polyvalent sexual subjectivity, one that was dissimilar to that of the invert of sexology in Ellis's work, and thus brings Jacob out of the lens of gay and lesbian studies and looks at this alternative approach in terms of analyzing the roots of Jacob's own sexuality, which is intriguing and promising in terms of further investigations. So to sum up here, the shifting approaches to the critical reception of Jacob's Room reflect and reveal not only the cultural capital of Woolf's work, but also the historical, theoretical, and aesthetic context of an entire century. And included in the PowerPoint, there are bibliographical listings of the works that were published decade by decade. In 2012, there was an extraordinary amount of activity, and there was only one or sometimes two in every other decade, which is kind of intriguing. So I will stop there, and thank you for listening, and we move onwards to our last presentation, and that will be Rita. And Rita, I'm going to clap for Rita. Rita is going to introduce herself.
Thank you, Vara. When Vara and Amy wrote to me last night asking if I could present shortly about the translation workshop today, I, of course, felt absolutely honored, and I hope that those of you who were at the lunch break on Saturday aren't too sick and tired of hearing about this. But, you know, after Beth's plenary today, I feel even prouder of what we as a group achieved during the 4 hours we worked together on translating the beginning of Jacob's Room. So I proposed this pre-conference workshop, as you might have seen from the call for participants that Amy kindly circulated about a month ago, as a way of engaging differently with Woolf's writings. The choice of Jacob's Room was a surprise I sprung on people, though Laura, I don't know if Laura's here anymore, but Laura guessed it. And of course she did. Yay, Laura, of course you guessed it was going to be Jacob. So, but I didn't announce this at first because I wanted it to be a surprise for people, and I didn't want them. Some people asked me if they had any homework to do in preparation for the workshop, and I wanted them to come fresh and not really know what they were going to do ahead of time. So I'm just going to briefly share my screen just to show you something very quickly, I promise, about the workshop itself. So, okay, this is it. Okay, and I'm gonna make this bigger. Okay.
That's working. Yay.
Okay, good. So from the moment I proposed this originally, it was just how should one read Woolf? But of course, from then I included another bit to that title, and I said, how else should one read Woolf? Because the main idea with the workshop was to propose the idea of translation as a mode of reading. Okay, so what did that mean for us? First of all, of course, the obvious reference, what I was going for here is, of course, and we've heard more about this essay today from Beth, was to use the proposal that Woolf brings forward in how should one read a book, and apply that and change that slightly for the work of translation. So this is what we have in the version published in the Common Reader too. I know there's a textual history there, but this bit hasn't changed. So the quickest way to understand the elements of what a novelist is doing is not to read, but to write, to make our own experiments with the dangers and difficulties of words. And then I said, is not to, it shifted. It should be on top of write. The quickest way of understanding the elements of what a novelist is doing is not to read, but to translate, is what it meant to do. It shifted somehow. I apologize for that. And for around that essay, there are other passages in which it talks about reading, and I substituted that for translation every time, and to see how that would work. So that was the main idea. And of course, I was also drawing from Spivak, who says in the text that I circulated ahead of time that translation is the most intimate act of reading. And after TED, maybe closer perhaps with, also thinking about Kate and Vara, of course, perhaps close to editing as well. Editing, I would say, is also a very intimate act of reading. So that would be that granular aspect would be there as well. But something else that Spivak says is that translation is not only necessary, but unavoidable, and that the text guards its secret. It is impossible. But finally, also that we cannot help but translate what we love, and that translation can be thought in many metaphorical ways. The workshop itself was thought of in terms of progress and negotiation, and another word that popped around that popped up in Beth's talk today was the provisionality. That was also something that we worked on. We worked on various drafts of translation, not a final product itself. So this was the hands-on activity that we did during the workshop itself. I did not know of what Ben just posted on the chat. I didn't know that MAP had the first edition of Jacob's Room digitized. So I actually had to ask a friend from Oxford to run to the board and grab me pictures, because I wanted people to translate, to have the proper, to choose a source text, the copy text for the translation itself. So this is what we worked on for our translation, for our various translations. So the first 2 paragraphs, not the first whole page, just until the blood had spread. I anticipated some places where people might want to focus on. Some of these issues were more semantic and lexical, others were grammatical. And one of the things that we noticed doing this very close and intimate reading for translation was something that Ted highlighted here as well, the strangeness of the text. So this expression here, her eyes fixed, was something we zoomed in and spent quite a lot of time discussing. The use of fixed, is this a verb? Is this an adjective? Are we describing her eyes? Are her eyes fixed? Or is fixed being used here as an intransitive verb? Fixed on what? And what could be done in the 10 languages we were translating into in terms of this intransitionality? So would this be something that, 1, we could do? And 2, would this be something that would be considered acceptable in translation? And we also discussed editors and practices in publication that certain strangenesses in the text are very often less acceptable in translation than they are in originals. So that was something that we fixed on. And so finally, after the 4-hour workshop, we had the draft, and everyone had their draft. Some people worked together in pairs, other people worked alone. And I asked everyone to produce a reading version and send it to me by Wednesday, so that I would have their reading version to present, but also so they could talk about this in the presentation itself. But also, and again, another surprise that I did people was that I wanted them to send this ahead of time so that I could send them, so that I could share with everyone. Amy, I don't think I'm able to share the PDF, so I'm not able to upload things, it seems. Let's see.
I've just made you a co-host. Is it working better now?
Let's see if I can. Nope. Let me close the chat and open it again, maybe.
I think we're being attacked by the gremlins.
Nope. Maybe you can do it, Amy. Do you have a copy of it, easy?
Maybe. Yes, I do.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Ben. Thank you so much, Ben. So this was also another surprise I sprung on people. I compiled the translations as a little booklet with all of them, and so we could have all the translations that, not every translation is there, only the ones by people who sent me by the Wednesday timeline, because I knew I was going to need some time to do it. So yeah, so this is our multilingual Jacob's Incipit, and that's it.
It's so beautiful. We really enjoyed looking at it last night when you showed it to us. Thank you.
Amazing. So I believe that we have now covered some very intriguing and in some ways unexpected territory. And I can say that the 4 of us who are actually the speakers could talk to each other, or perhaps it would be better to open the conversation to the audience, because I think that's been the standard for the rest of the panels for the most part.
I think that's a good idea. We're fairly short on time, actually. So
Yes.
it's probably good to do that. Yeah,
That's what I thought you would say. So
you.
we're on the same wavelength. And there are, I think, many questions and comments. And I actually wanted to start with Kate and the extraordinary ways that you were undertaking this task as a very young scholar. And that's not related to Jacob's Room, except for the fact that it's about a very young man.
I think I just didn't realize how, in a sense, unusual in some ways it was to be let loose on an original manuscript. And it wasn't that I didn't use manuscripts in my research, but my PhD research was on kind of late 19th century responses to Impressionist art. I wasn't being let loose on Jacob's Room. And it was just amazing. But I went into the bird collection day after day with a kind of yellow legal pad, and that was exciting because I wasn't used to those things myself. So there was a novelty in using American, what do you call it, stationery. And I take that as a kind of symbolic act of how, when I compare the sort of non-professional training that I had, I mean, in editing, but almost in being an academic in any way, with the kind of training that we try to give our graduate students today, with the kind of professional polish, with the kind of staged step by step chunks of their career, not just am I talking about grad students, but when I'm talking about non-tenured faculty members, when we're trying to get people to kind of map a career arc, all I can say was that the kind of rather haphazard and fragmentary nature of my approach to editing then, in some ways was super appropriate for Jacob's Room, which I think is such a slippery, and somebody earlier used the word shards. It's such a text of fragments and of trying to make sense of the world and then realizing that it's absolutely different from another point of view, so that the lack of coherence as a kind of youngish scholar possibly was a good thing when it came to trying to think flexibly about the text. But gosh, looking back, I realized I didn't have the confidence to think flexibly enough. I'd love to have another go at it.
The revision. Catherine Paul has her hand up, but I'm going to upstage you just because I want to get this question out. And I wanted to go to Suzanne and mention that I saw in your slides that you were using the Cambridge University Press publication, and Stuart Clark was not able to join us for this. And I was wondering whether you could say something about the value of the Cambridge publication and in terms of the, if you will, the evolution of the ways that Jacob's Room has been edited.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I found myself using Stuart and David's notes, mostly Stuart's, I think, as a kind of interpretive touchstone. So, you know, so I used the online version of the novel to look for incidences of the word old and incidences of the word elderly. And then, you know, I would look up old George Garfit just to see what Stuart had to say about it. You know, who was George Garfit? Was he old? What, you know, did he exist? And And in fact, in one of Stuart's notes, I didn't have time to say this, but one of the, in fact, you probably know this, Vara, because you read them all, but one of the early reviews, I forget which one, of Jacob's Room, is quoted in one of Stuart's notes, and the person said, Jacob is such a weird name for this person. Jacob is the right name for an old man. I don't understand why this young man has the name Jacob. So, you know, even though I've benefited immensely from the editions of many, many people of all of these Woolf novels, for me, it was the detail in the notes that was really overwhelming. And actually, you know, I co-edited Orlando, and Stuart and I kept up a lively correspondence throughout the thing. I mean, I finished mine slightly before he did, but we were working on them simultaneously about who had the most notes in their edition and whose book was fattest in the end. And I can tell you that Stuart won.
Isn't it 900 pages?
Oh, it's just so fat and big. You
Yes.
can't read it in bed or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't even read it on your lap.
No. So for me, that was it. And actually, when I edited Orlando, I started to see the novel completely differently from the way that I had seen it before. I felt that it was a historical novel, not really not even a fake biography, that actually, you know, I had to footnote all these things like, you know, in the 19th century, they suddenly start to eat muffins for tea instead of something else. So, you know, I read lots of histories of food and Isabella Beaton to find out, well, when did they start to eat muffins for tea? So to me, you know, it changed the sort of light in which I read the novel. And I think that Stuart's notes to Jacob's Room did the same thing. Anyway, I know we don't have much time. I'm going to stop.
But well said and well shared, and I think it's a promotion for the Cambridge edition, which is, I think, invaluable. And Catherine, you had a question.
I just want to thank everyone for this panel, which has been incredible. And Suzanne, what you said about changing ages and aging and reading, I think I was maybe 24 when I read Orlando with you in Ann Arbor, and I'm now elderly at 50.
Yes.
And I also wanted to say that one of my former students who read Woolf in a class with me in maybe 2004 or 5, Kelly Svoboda, has been at this conference. And I guess that means she's your grand student.
I knew I was old.
well, we all are. So
yes.
Anyway, I just wanted to sort of use that to thank you for what you did for me as a student, and for what your edition doubtless did for students, and for just all the things, and for your presentation. So thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much. And I really, you know, it may well be that I'm more narcissistic than other people, but when I was listening to Kate speak, I realized that what I was writing about in my, you know, remarks on Jacob's Room was really writing about my own encounter with the text and returning to it at different ages. And of course, when I was young, when I first read it, when I was in my early 20s, like you, Catherine, never occurred to me that the novel had any interest in middle-aged people, because I had very little interest in them. But now I'm pretty interested in them, and so I noticed them. So it was an encounter in that way.
Yeah, I had a similar experience coming back to Woolf at a later point, and having not paid any attention to the fact that Mrs. Dalloway had influenza, and now suddenly looking for all the places of illness, and they're everywhere, and she's amazing that way.
Yes, and Mrs. Dalloway also, I think, is 50-something.
Yes. And this is very, very Woolfian, that she's sort of Shakespeare with each shift in the perception of a particular cultural moment. All of a sudden you recognize things. I was wondering if anybody else has a hand up. Our chat moderator, as in conference organizer, has gone off to prepare for the next event. And I just wanted to make sure that we are getting full input from people, because there are many possible questions or comments, but I don't know what was going on in the chat. So if somebody has a hand up, it is Kate. And Catherine, you still have yours up, but I don't think you mean to. And also Ellen. Okay, so Ellen and then Kate.
Just brief, I want to mention a book I've been reading. I probably mispronounced her name. Jhumpa Lahiri,
Yes.
on translating myself and others. It's very interesting. And one insight, there's this space between the original language and the language you're translating it into. And when you're between the space, you see a lot. She herself has become devoted to Italian. So it's also a devotion to a certain kind of language that she wants to become. But I recommend it, and I wrote that in the chat. This idea of being between the two languages, not one, not the other, but in this in between, so that you have the territory of the two words. You know, the two different sets of words have two different territories and how they crisscross. She has a wonderful passage about that. Translating myself and others, very good. Recommend it.
Kate.
Yeah, I'd second that recommendation, but I also just wanted to say as a kind of footnote to Suzanne that I think that you managed to articulate there something that has been really apparent throughout everything that all of us have said, which is the really productive tension between returning to a novel over a period of 20, 30, 40 years, however long it might be, both from our own changing perspectives of where we are in our lives and our own highly kind of personal resonances that jump out of the text. And then on the other hand, but melded with it, the changing intellectual climate in which we're encountering the text. Both are, like, again, personal intellectual issues, but also the issues that are out there in a kind of academic intellectual ether. And that continual oscillation between the private and the personal and the outward and the public and the academic intellectual is so appropriate to Woolf and her continual turning from the inner to the outer and back again.
And I think that actually Ted said something very, very similar, that each time we encounter the book, it's a different book. Even when you read the same paragraph, as I was in various scholarly responses, the content of that paragraph started to evolve and shift because of the way it was being presented. So, and that's a matter of, you know, a 20-minute leap from one to another. It's like, oh, that's quite different. Thank you so much, Kate. And I see a hand, Benjamin.
Yes, I do hate to, Amy left me in charge.
Yes.
So what I'm about to say, you can blame her, not me. But
No.
I do think we may want to wrap things up and head over to the closing session. I'd like us all to thank our distinguished panelists. This has been a fantastic celebration of Jacob's Room at 100. So thank you so much for presenting this for us. This is especially a tall feat given how late on the last day of the conference this is, and we're all enraptured with these presentations. So thank you so much.
So applause for everybody. And thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you, Ted. You can't hear us, but you're included. And thank you for all the people with the wonderful, wonderful things that showed up in the chat. This has been amazing. And I think Jacob is proud.
Thank you, Vara. Thank you, everybody. See you soon in a few minutes, hopefully.
All right. And